Okay, and I mean, back then, were they, putting like Nazi tattoos on themselves? I know it was like there's a shamrock and there's a Nazi swastika, and they're used sometimes together or one or the other, right?
That's fairly contemporary. No, you didn't have individuals with swastikas. You had the shamrock, that's on my finger right here. And I don't know if you can see it. I can't get that ring off, but it's right there. It's the only mark I have relative to the Aryan Brotherhood. But it was a shamrock, and the idea of the shamrock was that oftentimes you'll see 3 6s in the clovers themselves, and that was the Antichrist or the beast, if you will. And really what it was anti-establishment. But you did not see the swastika. As a matter of fact, the knife fights I engaged in San Quentin were with the neo-Nazis. I took out their so-called Fuhrer at San Quentin because he was constantly talking out the side of his neck. And when the riot would start, he and his other neo-Nazis were nowhere to be found. So I don't have a lot of regard for Nazis and never have. And you'll find that true. But again, I'll say that you do have racists in any organization. Did some individuals in the Aryan Brotherhood have swastikas on them? Not that I know of. Not at the time that I was a member.
Okay, and the Aryan Brotherhood is headed by a 12-man council, which is topped by a 3-man commission?
It is now, yes.
Okay, but back then, was the structure that way or no?
No, the structure was that, you had 1 man, 1 vote. You didn't actually have that many members. And it was very difficult to get into the organization. I didn't know, for instance, when I had declined TD's recruitment offer, that's what most individuals were shooting for, was the ability and opportunity to become a member. So you had I'll say this, you had influential members like TD Bingham and others, but it was essentially 1 man, 1 vote.
Okay, so, at one point, I don't know whether it was the same back then, but new members had to take a blood oath and take a pledge?
Well, no, that is, I hear these things all the time. Blood in, blood out is what it's called. And usually it's law enforcement that coins that term in order to describe the dedication of the individual that belongs to the organization. There is no oath taken. There's no loyalty oath. The idea was that if you wanted to become a member, that you had to get your bones, and you got your bones through combat. And I think that's probably true. Getting your bones. It didn't require that you kill somebody, but that you put in work. Essentially, that's the term we used. If you put any work in. And so, to that extent, yes. But, the blood in, blood out, you'll get that mostly from law enforcement, who fancy themselves experts on not only the Aryan Brotherhood, but other gangs. But, to me, they're the equivalent of, the weekend warrior, armchair quarterback. Their intelligence is lacking, and usually comes from individuals that really have no association whatsoever with the organization. But it's taken as gospel because it's coming from law enforcement.
Well, when you look at, you look up the Aryan Brotherhood,
Mm-hmm.
and you look at what they do in prison,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of, the work they put in, it's drug trafficking, extortion, inmate prostitution, and murder for hire.
Yes.
Was that accurate back then as well?
I think so, yes. When I talk about controlling your resources, that's actually what I'm talking about. So you have obviously a limited population, but it could be as high as 3,500 and even more. And so it's a small city. So the idea is that if you're introducing drugs, narcotics into the institution, then that's one of your resources. If you're making alcohol, at Folsom we had 2 stills. So you had single still and double distill, and that's sold. You have prostitution, as you correctly point out. You have loan sharking. You have stores. Back then, an individual could receive a 50-pound package from home. So that was another means by which to generate revenues. So on average, I think that the FBI at one point estimated that the brand took $3.5 million out of Folsom in 1978 alone. And I think that's fairly accurate.
Okay, the inmate prostitution part. How
Yeah.
does that work exactly?
Well, what you have is you have individuals who are either turned out or that they're gay by choice. And essentially they become the women behind the walls. And so they're prostituted along that line. So you have a stable, you have an individual that pimps that stable, and you have your revenues as a result of that. You know, the greatest value, I think, probably with prostitutes behind the iron gates is their resources, their source of information. You know, because they're intermingling with all the races, and they're gathering information. They're bringing that information by way of counterintelligence, even as it relates to staff, because they're also being prostituted to staff. So it is extremely viable from a business perspective.
Well, I mean, just today we did a post. There's a post that's basically circling around the internet. There was a guy named Aaron Cox who was locked up for 32 months in the state of Pennsylvania Corrections Department. And he basically describes how when he was 20 years old, he was young and he was stupid. He got busted for a gun and 2 ounces of cocaine. He got sent to state prison for only 32 months. Mm-hmm. And when he got there, he was a little skinny kid, and his cellmate was a big, muscular guy. And essentially, he became a prison wife.
Yes.
And he agreed to basically have sex with this man. He said that the guy never prostituted him to other people. He basically kept him to himself. Mm-hmm. And he said this happens actually, very often.
Yes.
And he actually said there's a name for it called protective pairing.
It is protective pairing. In other words, the individual that takes him in, first he becomes what we call a cell mouse. And so he launders, he cleans up the cell, he cooks, he does things like that. But if he is in fact turned out to become a woman in that context, then yes, he's paired with that individual, and that becomes that individual's wife. I've seen many of those relationships turn into extremely dangerous situations because of jealousy, somebody attempting to push up on that individual's girl, and is killed as a result.
I mean, you coming into this situation, I mean, you've been free up to 22 years old, and suddenly you're going in and men are being wives and being prostituted and just the insanity of this all. How did you really get your head around all that?
Well, it isn't to say that I wasn't approached by queens at the time. I was. They'll slide up next to you as you're walking down center corridor and talk about, ooh baby, I need a daddy. And they're serious. But, my response once I understood what I was dealing with was, I hear you, sweetheart, but I don't use. So it's a matter of respect. I always treated individuals that were doing that with me with respect, and I think that was appreciated. So it's all in how you deal with things. It's your mindset, it's your demeanor, it's your character. And how you approach the situation in which you're in. If you're going to allow yourself to be dominated, then you will be dominated. That's not my character.
Well, the murder for hire part.
Yes.
How exactly did that work?
Well, it's the best example, I suppose, is in with John Gotti, for instance. Now, John Gotti was under the Aryan Brotherhood's protection in the feds. So one of the things from a business perspective that the brand looked at was picking up contracts from the Italian mob to carry out for them. That would be the highest point of that murder for hire concept that you're talking about. Within the concept of the 70s and prison, it was extremely rare. You had individuals who did engage in that, but I'm sitting here right now trying to think of an instance that I can give you by way of example, and I can't think of one. You had many knife fights, but back then all that was head up. You didn't have assassinations, you had knife fights. So that if you had a murder for hire, that usually involved drugs, and that was usually the payoff relative to that. You want to remember, Vlad, that back then a pack of Lemax, a pack of Camels, tailor-mades, would facilitate a murder. So pretty cheap.